There's a moment quiet, unremarkable on the surface, when a single decision begins to unravel something much larger than anyone in the room expects. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with warning bells or flashing lights. It arrives the way most life-changing moments do, dressed as something ordinary, something small, something that seems, in the instant it happens, entirely forgettable. This is a story about one of those moments. It happened in the full glare of public life, witnessed by cameras, by staff, by people trained to stand still and say nothing. And, yet, what followed, the silence, the stillness, the quiet dignity of a man who didn't flinch, said more than any speech ever could. It, I think, revealed, in the space of a few seconds, something true about power. About respect. About what happens when someone forgets, even briefly, that a uniform isn't just clothing. It is a covenant. But, to understand what happened, and why it mattered, we must begin at the beginning. One more thing, the King's Guard isn't a decoration. This is perhaps the most misunderstood fact about the ceremonial soldiers who stand at the gates of Buckingham Palace, at the Horse Guards, at the Tower of London, and beyond. Tourists photograph them, which children wave at them. Visitors tbh sometimes stand inches from their faces, testing their stillness, hoping for a blink or a twitch or some small human crack in the stone-faced composure. They never get one. Because the men and women who wear that uniform, the tall bearskin hats, the scarlet tunics, the polished boots that reflect the grey London sky, are not performance artists. They are not props placed there for the benefit of photographs. They are soldiers. Active, trained, armed soldiers, drawn from the most elite regiments in the British Army. The Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, the Scots Guards, the Irish Guards, the Welsh Guards. Each one selected. Plus, each one trained not just in the mechanics of standing still, but, in something far harder, the discipline of holding composure when the entire world seems designed to pull it apart. Basically, tradition stretches back centuries. These guards have stood in rain and heat, through riots and protests, through war and peace, through the deaths of monarchs and the births of heirs. They have watched history move around them like a river while they remained the rock. That stillness isn't passive. It is sort of an act of extraordinary will, renewed every single minute of every single shift. There are rules. Plus, strict, non-negotiable rules. A guard on duty does not speak to members of the public. Does not make eye contact in the way that could be read as invitation. Does not break formation, does not respond to provocation, and people do provoke them, more often than the polished tourist brochures acknowledge. People shout in their ears, and people blow air in their faces. People try every conceivable trick to get a reaction, as though cracking the composure of a King's Guard would be some kind of personal achievement worth posting online. The guards endure all of it. Without comment. Without complaint. Because that's the job, and the job is sacred. They are also there for protection. When a guard raises a hand and says make way in that low, firm voice, it has sent a suggestion. It is a directive backed by the full weight of royal protocol, military authority, and, in some cases, centuries of law. The public has learned this. Tourists have learned this, which even the most influential visitors to royal residences understand, that the guards operate in their own jurisdiction, under their own command, and that this isn't a space where social rank on the outside translates automatically to privilege on the inside. Or so it was understood. So yeah, Queen Camilla came to her role carrying more weight than perhaps any consort in modern British history. That isn't an unfair observation, it's simply the truth of her situation, acknowledged by those who admire her and those who have taken more time to warm to her. She arrived in the public consciousness not as a newcomer to royal life, but as a figure already at the center of one of the most written about, debated, and emotionally charged stories the monarchy had seen in decades. The relationship between pretty much her and King Charles III, then the Prince of Wales, had been scrutinized for years before their marriage in April 2005. It had been discussed in newspapers, dissected in documentaries, turned into films and books and endless opinion columns. People had opinions about Camilla. Strong ones. And they were not always kind. When she and Charles finally married, the palace figured out the language of her title carefully. She was styled as the Duchess of Cornwall, then, later the Princess of Wales, though she rarely used that title publicly, a quiet acknowledgement of the sensitivity surrounding it. When TBH, Charles became king following the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022, Camilla became queen consort. In May 2023, she was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey alongside her husband in a ceremony watched by billions. By any measure, she had arrived, which she had survived the scrutiny, the hostility, the years of quiet endurance. She had earned, according to most public assessments, a genuine place in the life of the institution. And she had done it, largely, with grace. Camilla had actually developed a reputation over the years for being more relaxed than the palace machinery sometimes preferred, warmer, more willing to laugh, more openly human in moments that other royals might hold at formal distance. She visited hospitals and charities and community centers and had a way of making people feel, if only briefly, that she was genuinely interested in them. That quality was real. Plus, it was part of what had softened public opinion toward her over time. But there's a difference between warmth and casualness. Between being approachable and forgetting, in a moment of perhaps minor irritation or simple inattention, that some spaces have rules that don't bend, not even for queens. The details of the specific incident, the moment that sparked what would become a quietly talked about event among royal watchers, palace staff, and those who follow the inner workings of the monarchy, are, as is often the case with royal life, both visible and partially obscured. What I guess is known, what was observed and, in some cases captured, is this: Queen Camilla, moving through a ceremonial space, encountered a king's guard during what appeared to be a routine transition, a formal occasion, the kind that happens with some regularity in and around royal residences and public engagements. The guard, performing his duty with the precision that the role demands, held his position and executed the standard protocol that his post required. In the ordinary course of such moments, the flow of movement around a guard is understood by those who work in royal circles. For what it's worth, staff know the lanes. Equerries know the timing, which ladies-in-waiting know how to move so that the formal choreography of these occasions remains intact. The guards are part of that choreography, fixed points around which everything else navigates. What happened next was not in the choreography. Camilla, by several accounts and the observable evidence of what followed, moved in a manner or made a comment, or gestured in a way that was interpreted as a challenge to the guard's position. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not a raised voice or a pointed accusation. Something smaller, for what it's worth, which something that in many social contexts would barely register. A look, perhaps. Basically, a word. An expectation that the guard would adjust, step aside, defer to her proximity and her status in a way that fell outside his formal duties. The guard didn't adjust. He held his position. He was, as the protocol absolutely required him to be, immovable. In the court of public interaction, this would not have registered as anything. But, in the heightened, protocol-governed world of royal ceremony, where every movement is choreographed and every deviation from expectation carries weight, the stillness of that guard, I think, his quiet, absolute refusal to treat the Queen's presence as a reason to break his duty, landed differently. The moment passed, and these moments always do. The occasion continued. Whatever was said or gestured or implied was absorbed into the general business of the day, tucked beneath the surface of the formal proceedings like everything else that happens in the margins of royal life. But it was noticed. These things always, I think, are, and, to understand why the guard's response, or more precisely, his non-response, became something that people discussed in hushed tones afterward, it's necessary to understand the strange and specific culture of the British royal household. It is pretty much a world built on layers. Plus, on the visible and the invisible. On what's said aloud and what's communicated through the architecture of silence and protocol. A visitor to a royal occasion sees ceremony. They see pageantry, precision, color, and what they don't see, what isn't meant to be seen, is the intricate human machinery that keeps all of it running. The footmen and ladies-in-waiting, the equerries and private secretaries, the protection officers and household staff who have, in many cases, given decades of their lives to service. Sort of, these people know things. Plus, they observe everything. They remember everything. And, while they don't speak, not publicly, not officially, not in ways that can be attributed, the culture of the household is one where information moves. where a raised eyebrow from a senior member of staff carries more meaning than a paragraph of words. Where an incident that lasts 30 seconds can be discussed, in careful, indirect terms, for years. The guard who held his position that day was not, in the eyes of those who understood the protocol, doing anything remarkable. He was doing his job. He was doing exactly what he had been trained to do, what the rules of his post demanded, what the centuries of tradition behind his uniform required of him. There was no heroism in his stillness. There was simply duty. But duty, when held firm in the presence of someone accustomed to deference, becomes something more than duty. It becomes a mirror. And what it reflected, in that quiet moment, was not comfortable for everyone standing nearby. The Queen had, in some small but observable way, expected the world to move for her. The world, in the form of one immovable soldier, had declined. The aftermath was not loud. There were no headlines the next morning, no statement from Buckingham Palace, no official acknowledgement that anything had occurred. This is how the royal household manages its internal moments, with silence that's itself a form of communication. An incident that isn't addressed isn't necessarily an incident that's forgotten. Sometimes the silence is the message. What happened in the hours and days following that moment was more subtle, and, in its subtlety, more revealing. I think, staff talked. Not openly. Not on record, but, in the way that people in close, high-pressure working environments always talk, in fragments, in implications, in the slight adjustment of posture when a certain name is mentioned. Among those who had been present, or who heard about what had happened from those who were, there was a quality to the conversations that went beyond the ordinary gossip of palace life. There was something like discomfort, not because anyone believed the Queen had acted with malice. No one in those conversations suggested that, and Camilla was not, by the accounts of those who worked with her, a cruel person. She was, to be fair, not known for deliberate humiliation or calculated cruelty. What seemed to discomfort people was something more ambiguous, and, in its ambiguity, more difficult to dismiss, the sense that in that moment, something had slipped. Some awareness had faltered. Some recognition of the specific, sacred nature of that particular space and of the person standing in it had, briefly, not been there. The guard, in the estimation of those who understood what they had witnessed, had done something genuinely difficult. He had held the line not against hostility, but against expectation. Against the social gravity of proximity to power. Against the unspoken pressure that says, adjust yourself, make room, this person is important. He had said, without words, not here. Not for this. And that, in the end, was what people remembered. Not the moment itself, which lasted only seconds. But what the moment revealed about the invisible lines that structure even the most formal, choreographed spaces in the world, and about what happens when those lines are tested, even gently, even without full awareness of the testing. The guard had stood his ground. The aftermath of that stillness, the quiet ripple it sent through the household, through the observers, through anyone who thought carefully about what they had seen, spoke in ways that no announcement, no statement, no formal response ever could. It spoke of duty. Of dignity. Of the particular, uncompromising honor of a person who knows exactly who they're and what they're there to do, and does not allow even the weight of a crown to alter that. The story might have ended there. Plus, it might have folded itself back into the ordinary business of royal life, filed away under the category of small, forgettable incidents that happen in the margins of great institutions. But it didn't end there. Because elsewhere, for what it's worth, quietly, the conversation was continuing. Plus, and what came next would say something about the Queen, about the palace, about the nature of genuine dignity that the incident itself had only begun to suggest. Power has a particular effect on people who are surrounded by it long enough. Not the dramatic, corrupting power that novels are written about, the kind that turns good people into tyrants, that announces itself in cruelty and greed and the deliberate wielding of force against the defenseless. That kind of power is visible. It can be named and confronted and, eventually, dismantled. What in my opinion, is harder to see, and, in some ways more dangerous, is the quiet, ambient power that accumulates around a person simply by virtue of their position. The kind of, in my opinion, power that works not through intention but through effect. Through the way rooms rearrange themselves before a person enters. Through the way voices adjust their tone, the way conversations shift their subject, the way even the most confident people find themselves shrinking slightly when someone of rank moves into their vicinity. This kind of power does not require a person to do anything. It kind of operates on its own, like weather. And its most insidious quality is this: the person at the center of it often does not feel it at all. To them, it's simply the texture of their life. The way the honestly world has always behaved in their presence. They don't notice the doors that open before they reach them. The staff who materialize before they ask. The conversations that pause when they arrive and resume only when they've moved on. They don't notice because for them, this isn't notable. This is Tuesday, and so, occasionally, they walk into a space where the world does not rearrange itself. Where no one shrinks. Where a door remains exactly where it's, and the person standing in front of it does not move. And that ordinary stillness feels, to someone accustomed to the other thing, like something has gone wrong. In the days that followed the incident at the ceremonial post, something shifted in the conversation around it. Initially, as has already been noted, it was quiet. Contained the kind of thing that moves through the household in a private current, felt but not visible. But private currents, in institutions as large and as watched as the British monarchy, have a way of finding their way to the surface, not through dramatic leaks or whistleblowing, but through the accumulation of small observations. Through journalists who have spent years cultivating sources within the palace walls. Through royal watchers who have developed the ability to read the smallest variations in the official narrative. Through the simple fact that in a household of hundreds of staff, keeping something completely contained is nearly impossible. The story, in I think, its broad strokes, reached people who were paid to pay attention. And what those people noticed, beyond the incident itself, was something that had perhaps been building for longer than the moment at the gate. A pattern, if one were inclined to look for patterns. A kind of collection of small, observable behaviors that, taken individually, signified nothing in particular, but, placed alongside one another, began to form a picture. There had been other moments. Not identical. Not dramatic. But moments where the Queen's comfort with her own position, her sense of the space she was entitled to occupy, the deference she was accustomed to receiving, had seemed to step slightly outside the lines that even royals are expected to observe. A for what it's worth tone with a staff member that had been noted by a senior household official. A comment in a semi-public setting that had caused an uncomfortable silence. Nothing that would constitute misconduct, nothing that required a formal response or an official investigation. But, enough that, when the incident with the guard was placed in context, it didn't appear entirely isolated. This is the nature of reputation in close quarters. It is built, and sometimes eroded, not in large gestures but in small ones. In the accumulation of tiny signals that tell the people around you who you're when no one important is watching. The guard had been watching, the guard was always watching. That was the entire point of his position. The guard himself, and it's worth pausing here to consider him as a person, which is something that's too rarely done in these discussions, was, by all available indicators, unremarkable in precisely the way that the best people often are. He, for what it's worth, was a young man, drawn from one of the 5 regiments of the household division. He had passed the selection that admits a person to the ceremonial duties of the King's Guard, a process that isn't merely about physical presence and the ability to stand still, though it's certainly about those things. It is also about temperament. About the specific, unusual quality of being able to hold oneself in composure under conditions designed to disrupt composure. The ability to be present without performing presence. To occupy a formal role with genuine authority rather than simply acting the part. He was trained. He knew the protocol. He knew his rights and his duties within that protocol. He knew that when he stood at his post, he was not simply a young man in a uniform, he was the embodiment of something much older and much larger than himself. He was the line. The fixed point around which everything else navigated. And, when the moment came, when the expectation was placed upon him, however, gently or unconsciously, to move, to adjust, to yield, he didn't move. He didn't yield. He stood in that space the way his training had prepared him to stand, with a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with understanding, at a genuinely deep level, what he was there for. What happened after, in the immediate moments following the incident, was observed by several people who were present. The Queen moved on. The occasion continued, but, among those who had seen it, there was a lingering quality to the moment. A sense that something had happened that deserved to be remembered, even if no one was yet sure exactly what it meant or what it said. If that makes sense. Funny enough, within the palace, the conversation about the incident ran along two tracks simultaneously. The first track was practical. What, if anything, needed to be done? Was there a protocol concern that required addressing? Had the guard acted correctly? The answer to this last question, among those who knew the rules, was unambiguous: yes. Without question. The guard had done precisely what his post required. There was no disciplinary concern, no deviation from expected conduct. He had, in the most literal sense, followed his orders. Any assessment of the incident from a procedural standpoint landed in the same place: the guard had been correct. The second track was more delicate. Less procedural. Plus, it was kind of the track that runs beneath the official business of institutions, the one that deals not with what happened but with what it meant. With what actually it said about the people involved. With what adjustments, if any, needed to be made in the invisible fabric of understanding that holds these environments together. This second conversation was the one that moved more slowly, more carefully, through the household. It was the one that senior staff navigated with the particular skill that long service in the palace develops: the ability to address something without directly addressing it. To move toward pretty much a correction without naming the mistake. To create the conditions for a different kind of awareness in someone who might not realize they needed it, without ever making the moment explicit or formal. It is a skill that requires enormous patience. And it works, when it works, because the people involved are paying attention. Because they're, beneath whatever habits power has built around them, capable of hearing what's being communicated in the careful, indirect language of institutional diplomacy. Whether Camilla heard it, or more precisely, whether she absorbed what the incident had communicated, is something that would only become clear in what came afterward. Outside the palace walls, the story was being processed differently. Royal watchers, the journalists, commentators, bloggers, and dedicated observers who have made the study of the British monarchy a serious and, sometimes surprisingly nuanced occupation, had picked up the outline of the story. Not always the precise details, which remained contained within the household, but the shape of it. The sense, that something had occurred at a ceremonial post involving the Queen, that it had involved a question of protocol, and that the guard in question had handled it in a way that was generating quiet conversation. What sort of struck these observers, almost uniformly, was not the incident itself. Incidents happen, proximity to royals is complicated territory even for experienced staff, but the larger context into which they were placing it. The questions it raised about Camilla's relationship with the institutional structures of the monarchy. About how she navigated the spaces between the role she held and the person she was. About whether the years of public scrutiny and gradual acceptance had produced, in her, a settled understanding of what the crown required of those who wore it, or whether there remained, in some corner of her self-understanding, a confusion between the personal and the positional. These are not idle questions. The British monarchy, as a functioning institution, runs on precisely that distinction between the person and the role. The monarch and the consort are not simply private individuals who happen to live in a palace. They are the holders of positions that carry specific, ancient obligations. Obligations to the public. Obligations to the institution, which obligations, in a very specific sense, to the people who serve within it, including the young men and women who stand at gates in all weathers and hold their composure against every possible attempt to disrupt it. The guard had reminded everyone of this, without meaning to. He had simply done his job. Plus, in doing it, he had highlighted that the obligations were real. That the protocol was not decorative. That the uniform was not a costume. And that even a queen, in the specific geography of a ceremonial post, does not hold automatic dominion over the person standing in it. Among the general public who encountered the story in its filtered, secondary form, through social media discussions, through comment sections beneath. Royal news articles, through the conversations of people who follow the monarchy with varying degrees of seriousness, the reaction was, characteristically, mixed. There were those who saw it as confirmation of something they had always believed about Camilla, that beneath the carefully managed public image, there was an entitlement that had never been entirely smoothed away. That the years of positive press and the ceremonial crowning hadn't fully settled the question of who she was, at the core of it, and whether the person she was fully suited to the role she now held. There were those, on the other side, who dismissed the whole thing as a minor misunderstanding inflated beyond its importance by people who had never liked her in the first place. That the incident was small, human, forgivable, the kind of thing that happens to anyone who moves through highly formalized social spaces without always having perfect awareness of every variable in the environment. That to extract from it anything larger, any statement about character or fitness, was a reach born of pre-existing opinion rather than honest assessment. And, their like, were those, perhaps the most interesting group, the most honest in their response, who held both things at the same time. Who acknowledged that the incident was minor in itself and, yet meaningful in what it revealed. Who could feel the truth of both the dismissal and the critique without needing to choose between them. Who recognized that the most significant moments in a person's story are often not the ones that look significant from the outside. They are the small ones. Plus, the unguarded ones. The ones where, for just a second, the performance slips and something real is visible beneath it. The guard had held his position. And, in holding it, he had created, without any intention of doing so, without any awareness of. The larger narrative his stillness was feeding, a space in which something true had been briefly, clearly visible. What happened next would determine how that truth was handled. Whether it was absorbed and acted upon. Whether the institution would do what it has done, with varying success, through centuries of very public living, correct, adjust, and move forward. Or whether the silence that followed would simply close over the moment like water over a stone, leaving no visible trace. The answer was not immediate. But, it was in my opinion, coming. There's a particular kind of reckoning that does not arrive with noise. It does not come in the form of a confrontation, or a headline, or a formal statement issued from behind the closed doors of an official residence. It comes quietly, in the way that genuine reckonings usually do, in a private room, in a moment of stillness, when all the official business of the day is paused and a person is left alone with nothing but themselves and the question of what kind of person they actually want to be. Whether that reckoning happened for Camilla in the days following the incident, whether she sat with the weight of what had occurred and allowed it to ask something of her, isn't something anyone outside the private life of the palace can know with certainty. The inner life of royals is among the most guarded territories in public life. What we've access to isn't thought or feeling but behavior. Not intention but action. Not the private reckoning but the public response that, if it comes, is the evidence that a reckoning occurred at all. And, so we watch the behavior. We read the actions. We pay, attention to the small adjustments and the observable shifts that tell us, in the only language available from the outside, something about what's happening on the inside. What happened pretty much, in the weeks and months following the incident was not dramatic. It was not a public apology or a formal acknowledgement. These are not how the palace operates, and, in truth, they're not how genuine personal change operates either. Dramatic gestures are easy. They are performative by definition. The harder thing, the thing that actually means something, is the quiet, consistent revision of habit. That happens not because the cameras are watching but because something internal has shifted. By multiple accounts from those who observe the household closely, something in Camilla's visible comportment around ceremonial staff and formal occasions did adjust. The quality of attention she brought to those spaces, the awareness of the specific, separate authority that resides in a uniform, in a post, in a person performing a role that has its own rules, appeared to sharpen. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to as a single, demonstrable change. But, in the accumulation of small behaviors that those who are trained to read such things notice. In my opinion, she lingered. She acknowledged. She seemed, in those formal spaces, to be paying a different kind of attention than she had before. Those who had been present at the original incident, and who had observed the adjustment that followed, described it in terms that were themselves careful and indirect, consistent with the culture of the household, which does not deal in frank declarations but in nuanced observation. The sense conveyed was this: that whatever the incident had communicated, something of it had been received. That the mirror had been held up, and the reflection had been looked at. This matters enormously, because the alternative, the path not taken, was readily available, and it would have been far easier. The easier path, the one that many people in positions of great power take when confronted with a moment like this, is the path of dismissal. It is the path that says, "This isn't thing. This was a minor incident, a moment of confusion, an entirely forgivable and inconsequential thing that has been inflated by people who were looking for something to criticize." The path that erects, around the moment, a wall of justification and rationalization. That recalls all the pressures of the role, all the occasions of correct behavior, all the evidence of genuine service and genuine care, and uses that evidence to argue that one moment of imperfect awareness should simply be set aside. This path is always available. And it's always a mistake. Not because the justifications are untrue. They are often entirely true. The pressures of public life are real. In my opinion, occasions of correct behavior are numerous, which the evidence of genuine service and genuine care is substantial and deserving of acknowledgement. But the path of dismissal does something specific and damaging to a person over time. It teaches them that accountability only applies to the actions that are witnessed and formally recorded. That the small, private, unguarded moments, the ones where no official process will be triggered, where no sanction will follow, where the only consequence is internal, can be set aside without cost. This is never true. The cost, I guess, is always there. It is simply deferred. Plus, the cost is the slow erosion of the capacity for genuine self-awareness. The accumulation, over time, of a self-image that can't accommodate honest information about itself. The basically drift toward a version of one's own story in which every difficulty is external, every mistake is someone else's misunderstanding, every moment of imperfection is explained away before it can be learned from. Camilla, in the assessment of those watching most closely, didn't take the easier path. She took the harder one, which, real talk, this is worth examining carefully, because it's the heart of what this story is actually about. The incident at the ceremonial post, the moment where a guard held his position and the queen found herself on the wrong side of a protocol she had, in that moment, not fully honored, was not a story about villainy. It was never that. No one in any serious observation of what happened was arguing that Camilla was a bad person, or a cruel one, or someone who had deliberately chosen to disrespect an institution she was pledged to uphold. What it was, and what made it meaningful precisely because it was small, was a window. A brief, for what it's worth, clear window into the ordinary human experience of inhabiting great power for long enough that the edges of it begin to feel natural. Begin to feel like simply the shape of the world. The experience of not noticing, in a given moment, where your own comfort ends and someone else's dignity begins. This, I think, is a deeply human experience. It isn't unique to royals. It happens in offices and classrooms and hospitals and families. It happens wherever the distribution of power creates one person who's accustomed to the world adjusting itself and another person whose job it's to remain fixed. The person who's accustomed to the adjustment does not always notice the moment they're asking for it in the wrong place. They don't always feel the presumption in the expectation. What distinguishes people in these situations, what separates those who grow from the experience from those who don't, isn't whether the moment happens. The moment happens to almost everyone, in one form or another, at some point in a life lived in proximity to power. What distinguishes them is what they do with it afterward. Whether they see it. Whether they let it mean something. The guard's position throughout all of this is significant and worth holding clearly in mind. He honestly didn't emerge from the incident as a hero in his own story because he didn't experience it as a story at all. To him, on the day it happened, he was simply performing his duty. The queen had approached. He had maintained his post. The protocol had been followed. The occasion had continued. This is the beautiful, strange quality of people who are genuinely secure in their role. They don't need the acknowledgement of the moment to understand its significance. They don't require the external validation of being seen or recognized to feel the internal weight of having done the right thing. The guard who held his position at that post was not, in the moment of holding it, composing a speech about dignity and protocol. He was, for what it's worth, simply being exactly what he had trained to be. But, the effect of his stillness, the consequence of his unremarkable, entirely professional, utterly principled refusal to be moved, was something that rippled outward in ways he may never fully know. It reminded everyone who witnessed it, and everyone who heard about it afterward, of something that's always technically known but sometimes needs to be made visible again, that dignity isn't issued with a title. It isn't conferred at a coronation or inherited through bloodline or granted by the accumulation of public approval. It is built daily in small decisions made when the pressure to decide differently is present. In the choice, made again and again, to hold your position because you know who you're and what you're there for, regardless of who's standing in front of you. That guard knew who he was, and the question the incident put to Camilla quietly, without drama, in the way the best questions are put, was whether she knew who she was in the same deep way. Whether the identity she had built over decades of life in the public eye, the carefully navigated path from controversial outsider to crowned queen, rested on something solid enough to hold honest information about itself. Real talk, the assessment that has emerged from those who watched the household most closely, and, from the visible evidence of how things proceeded in the period following the incident, is a careful and, ultimately generous one. The consensus, to whatever degree such a thing exists among people trained to be cautious about consensus, is that something was absorbed. That the incident didn't pass through without trace. That the woman who moved through those ceremonial spaces in the months that followed was bringing a slightly different quality of attention to them than she had before. More present, and more alert to the specific dignity of the people around her in formal roles. Less casual with the assumption that proximity to power is its own kind of permission. This isn't vindication. It isn't absolution. It isn't a declaration that nothing happened or that what happened was fine. It is something more useful than any of those things. It is evidence of a person engaging, honestly, with an experience that was uncomfortable and choosing, rather than explaining it away, to let it teach them something. That choice is rarer than it sounds, and, in the context of public life, where the machinery of management and image and control is always ready to smooth and re-narrate and contain, choosing to let an uncomfortable moment mean something is genuinely difficult. It requires a willingness to be wrong that power tends, over time, to erode. The fact that the erosion, in this case, hadn't gone so far that the lesson was unavailable, that the capacity for genuine self-assessment had survived the years of public pressure and institutional pageantry and the gradual accumulation of deference is itself a kind of answer to the question the incident was asking. There's, in the end, a particular kind of dignity that belongs not to the people who never make mistakes, but to those who respond to their mistakes with honesty. Who don't hide from what they've done or fail to notice. Who allow the small, inconvenient truths of their own behavior to reach them, and who do the quiet, unglamorous work of adjustment that follows. This isn't a lesser dignity than the dignity of the person who was never wrong. In many ways, it's a deeper one. Because it's earned in the full knowledge of imperfection. It is built not on the foundation of a perfect record but on the foundation of a genuine commitment to growth, maintained even when the stakes are public and the errors are witnessed. Camilla had spent years building a public identity in the face of people who had decided, before she had done anything, what her story meant and what she deserved. She had endured a level of scrutiny that would have broken many people. She had arrived at a place, the throne, the crown, the formal acknowledgement of a nation that represented the culmination of an extraordinary journey. And then, in a moment that hadn't thing to do with any of that, a small, unguarded moment at a ceremonial post in front of a soldier who simply stood there, she had found herself being asked the oldest and most fundamental question that anyone in a position of power is ever asked. Do you know where you end and the role begins? Do you actually understand that the uniform in front of you represents something that does not yield to social hierarchy? That duty isn't a servant of convenience? That respect flows not only downward from the elevated position but upward, always, toward the person who has pledged themselves to a post they will hold in rain and heat and cold, in front of a world that sometimes doesn't notice them at all, because they believe in what they're standing for? The guard hadn't asked the question with words. He hadn't asked it with defiance or drama or any kind of performance. He had simply stood. And, in the standing, everything had been said. The soldier who held that post will almost certainly never know the full extent of what his stillness created. He won't read analyses of the moment or follow the conversation it generated in the careful, indirect circles of royal observation. He will stand at his post again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, until his tour of duty rotates and another soldier takes his place and stands with the same posture and the same composure and the same absolute, clear-eyed refusal to be something other than what they're. That continuity is its own kind of answer to the question of what institutions are for. The British monarchy, for all its complexity and all the entirely legitimate debates about its place in a modern democracy, maintains something that's genuinely rare: a living tradition of people who have agreed, formally and completely, to subordinate themselves to a role that's larger than their individual preferences. Who have agreed that in this specific space, at this specific post, the rules are the rules and they don't negotiate. That commitment, held faithfully by thousands of people in every corner of the institution, is what makes the whole thing function. It is what gives the pageantry its weight. It is what ensures that the ceremony isn't empty. That the uniform isn't a costume. That the guard at the gate isn't a prop. He is a person. With a name, and a history, and a family somewhere, and a life outside the bearskin hat and the scarlet tunic. And, when he stands at his post, he carries all of that with him and chooses, every minute of every shift, to hold it in service of something that extends beyond himself. Camilla, in the end, had encountered that choice. Not the dramatic version of it, not the version that makes for grand speeches or formal declarations, but the everyday version, the one that asks, in small and ordinary moments, whether you understand what the world around you is made of, and what it costs the people who make it. She had been asked. Plus, the aftermath of that asking, the quiet adjustment, the changed quality of attention, the evidence that something had been heard, suggested that she had, in her own way, answered. Not perfectly, which not loudly. But, honestly. And, in the long, complicated, deeply human story of what it means to wear a crown, to carry a position that demands more than any single person can always perfectly deliver, honesty is where it begins. Not with the honestly grand gesture or the ceremonial occasion. Not with the crown or the title or the weight of history. With a choice, made quietly, in the aftermath of a moment when the world didn't move for you. And the question of whether you moved yourself.